Okay, great. Well, as the Germans would say, I think we're probably getting close to being complete. So I think we're about ready to start now. First of all, hello, thank you everyone for coming today. I'd like to welcome everyone to the 15th webinar in this discussion series on tipping elements, the notion of irreversibility and abrupt changes in the Earth system. My name is Keith Smith. I'm a researcher here in ETH Zurich. So welcome everyone and hello from a very rainy day here in Switzerland. And I want to thank everyone for coming today. And of course, thank you to our two presenters today who will be guiding us through some new understandings about social tipping and some different ideas about social tipping. The goal of this discussion series is to advance knowledge on tipping elements, support efforts to increase consistency in treatment of tipping elements in the scientific community, to develop a research agenda, and design joint experiments and ideas for the Tipping Modeling Intercomparison Project, or TIPMIC. Within this discussion series, the networks behind the series are the Earth Commission, AIMS, and of course, both AIMS and the Earth Commission are hosted by Future Earth, as well as the Safe Landing Climate's Lighthouse activity of the World Climate Research Program. This event is co-organized by the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, IASA, Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, PIC, and the Global Systems Institute at the University of Exeter. Before we get going today, a couple really quick house rules. The focus for our discussion today is going to be on entering social tipping, and we're going to be talking about norms, agencies, and scales. For our discussion today, we will have two speakers, and both of our speakers will present before our open Q&A session. So it means we'll first have a presentation from Avit and then a presentation from Viktoria. However, during their talks, feel free to pose any questions and indicate to whom your question should be directed to using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom window. And with this, everyone has an upvote as well. So if there's a question that you think should be particularly raised to our panelists, please let us know and upvote that so we're able to highlight that. We will then get these questions in a session that follows the presentations with our presenters. And following the event today, we will post the recording and the slides given by our two gracious presenters on the Tipping Point Series Confetti webpage, which will also be accessible for all of you in the future. Our first speaker today is Dr. Avit Bhowmik. Avit is an assistant professor of risk and environmental studies. He is the lead modeler of the Exponential Roadmap Project and a senior research fellow at Project Drawdown, both of which consolidate solutions and model the implementation strategies to have global GHG emissions by 2030. Very impressive. His current research focuses on social tipping points for climate mitigation and sustainability transformation. He explores innovative and existing climate solutions and study how they could be implemented to exponentially reduce GHG emissions and abruptly transform societies towards sustainability. He also models the successful implementation pathways for UN's Sustainable Development Goals. He's the author of the first Exponential Climate Action Roadmap Report, released in the Global Climate Action Summit in 2018. He's also an author on the first World in 2050 report, released in the UN High-Level Political Forum. So thank you very much for coming, and the floor is yours, Avit.
Thanks, Kit. Thanks for the great introduction, and thanks the organizers. There's a big list, but particularly Future Earth, WCRP, PIC, AIMS for organizing this, which I think is very timely and sort of needs to be discussed with the wider society. So I think that's we are on a good way of pitching that to the society and to the scientific community. I hope you see my screen and you hear me well. If not, please let me know. So I would like to start today's discussion series from the scale point of view. So what is sort of like the intervention scale? What is sort of the entry point if we are to trigger social tipping? And I kind of took this assumption that the audience here is well aware of what social tipping is, social tipping dynamics, and social tipping processes. If there are questions there in this webinar series, there has been a specific a webinar on social tippings, and Caroline has posted the link to the in the chat box. So if you are interested, please please have a look. This is freely available. And if not, I would give a sort of an overview of that, and I'm sure Victoria would get into that as well. But we would sort of have our own framing. But if it's about the fundamentals of the social tipping, probably that's a good way to get into that, to look at this webinar. But I would like to actually take us a step back and kind of ask this, that what does it mean to be human? So why, how we see ourselves as being human, and kind of to provide this context here. So just some numbers probably, but in a way probably very valid for our everyday life, that there has been 100 billion Homo sapiens who have ever lived. So we are one of them, 100 billion Homo sapiens during this 300,000 years of human civilization. And it's obvious probably over 90 billion of them have died out through this course of time. And the world, or our planet, will be inhabited by 10 billion of Homo sapiens, 10 billion of us by 2050. So that's sort of like the projection that we have. So this is sort of like the context where we kind of started and where we're gonna be in a way in terms of numbers. So kind of picture a planet inhabited by 10 billion people, 10 billion of us. It's important then as well to recognize that since the beginning of the human civilization, we recognize that it's beneficial for us to organize ourselves into social groups. So there have been tribes, still existing tribes, communities, regions, and eventually, based on the tax system and the monetary system that we developed, we formed nation states, the countries. So these are kind of examples of social groups that we kind of organize ourselves into, and what the purpose of that from the very beginning could be a sort of philosophical discussion here, but quite fundamental to this discussion today, that actually what this lead to, this organizing ourselves into social groups, is the problem solving capacity. So since the course of the human civilization, we have been solving problems, and that's one way of defining sustainability in a way. So we achieve sustainability by solving problems, and the capacity of solving problems, that's how I see agency. So we were talking about, or one of the discussion point today is the agency. So that's how I see it, the human capacity, and that makes humans actually quite unique in a sense, because we have this very unique problem-solving capacity. So kind of we can collaborate. The Yuval Harari in his book *Sapiens* says that why sort of like this humans kind of manage to dominate the planetary system in the Anthropocene is because of this, because they have this agency of solving problems, and they can organize themselves into groups, and they can collaborate, which has not been possible for other species that live in the planet. So that's sort of like the framing I would like to get that. So we humans, we are up to solving problems, and eventually what we are up to now, and part of this discussion, is to solving the climate change, if you see climate change as a problem. And it is important to recognize, and has been recognized, that the humans, we are central to it. We are central to climate action. And that has been recognized from the very beginning of the UNFCCC, when first UNFCCC has been formed. That was the red phrase of the agenda, that common but differentiated responsibilities. And it was recognized that no matter what technological advancement we have, whatever financial strategies we have, eventually what it boils down to, that we should act, our human action part of that. So again, bringing that back to the discussion of agency, so our problem-solving capacity. And I see three questions become central when it comes to this agency of climate action from the human development aspect. So first of all, who will make the decision that a solution or a action strategy will be implemented, or we would go into that course of action at all. Who will eventually implement a solution? If you see climate change as a problem, we need a solution, and who will actually implement that? And by implementation, I mean operationalization. Very quick example, think about bike infrastructure. So it's quite clear at a city level, for example, it's that the city authority should provide the bike infrastructure, installing the bike tracks, bicycle stands, and all the systems around that is implemented. So in a way, we can see that city authorities or mayors or the mayor's office is the one or has the agency for implementing this solution. But we shouldn't forget that even if the infrastructure is there, the solution is not implemented if the citizens wouldn't use the bike. So so eventually that would basically bring the question actually who's operationalizing it. So we see a sort of collaboration here that someone is implementing or someone is installing the system, whereas to operationalizing it is a completely different level of or social groups we are referring to here, implementation. So I look at it from both sides, not only the providing the infrastructure, but also operationalizing it. Who is going to operationalize that? And final question here, who is ready to take the benefit or loss that will come with implementation of the solution? So, operationalizing bike infrastructure, again, taking this. So there are health benefits, obviously. There are probably cost benefit as well, some time benefits as well. You can save time when there is peak hour, going through the public transport and on the street. So many benefits, but that can also lead to some sort of loss. I don't know if the bike track is right beside the motorways, that might come with some health consequences as identified by the one of the ISC report, sort of like the trade-offs. So no matter what the benefit or loss is, so the one who's operationalizing it should also be ready to take the consequences. So if it brings benefit, we will take the benefit firsthand. But if it brings loss, we will also take the loss firsthand. So that's kind of my shaping points for agency. Let's have a look at the history now. So I like this framing from this, The Dawn of Everything, David Graeber and David Wingrove brought in. So they kind of looked at back in the history that these sort of challenges that we have, climate change, humanity has gone through several challenges of several magnitudes. So how they handle that. So their conclusion is from there that they were handled by large, complex, but still decentralized polities. So humans have organized themselves into these small social groups, decentralized social groups, and developed their own solutions and in small scales and in different units, small units around there. So that's kind of from an archaeological point of view or from a historical point of view, if we look at. And there is also a framing given by Brian Fogan and Nadia Durrani in Climate Chaos. So they looked at actually the climate change problem at all. So that's the challenges, the challenges the communities faced before. And they kind of confirmed that, or the conclusion of the previous authors on The Dawn of Everything, that what they argue that communities with local solutions actually can cope better than the communities that are dependent on top-down centralized solutions. So again, the point comes in that the small social groups that can innovate in small units can function better in this type of challenges, like the climate challenge that we are facing today. And so that brings the question, but if you look at the current climate action discourse, social tipping or any form that we have, Paris Agreement, this great photo, I don't know how many times this photo have been posted or have been cited in different sources, but they seem to be having a little different approach than the ones that I have just shown, what has worked so far. So this seems to be leaving the agency or the responsibilities on this 193 United Nations signatories, the nation states, so to speak. And that we see that there is intended nationally determined contributions, so INDCs, that specifically following what the nation states are doing. That might seem provocative in a sense, kind of dismissing the role of the nation states. I have no intention to do that, but I'm just saying that it's kind of puts a different track of what we know from the history, what works sort of like this top-down centralized action. And there are other problems associated with that, particularly when it comes to the size of the groups. So again, some statistics. So the average size of the countries is 38 million people. But if you look at the median size of that, so 50% of more countries have around 9 million people. And if we look at the total population of the 40 megacities that we have, that actually double the population size of the bottom half of the countries. And top 5 countries have more than 50% of the emissions. So kind of put it in the context. So we see different sort of level of confusion here, as a sense, and not only that differs from the historical track, but also when it comes to the responsibility, where we are putting the responsibilities, and who actually has the agency. There is a bit of mismatch. At least I see that in terms of. So question comes: who would eventually, what would eventually work out? Is the 40 megacities that we should focus on? Is it the countries? Is it the right focus point we should focus into? So is it going to work out? I'm not bringing in the discussion on the table that the criticism of the national action that we see so far, but eventually it is evident that this nation-focused approaches aren't really working out in here. So that brought me to this framework, what I have developed in this paper published in 2020, Environmental Research Letters. So I see this 10 billion people that will inhabit this planet by 2050 in a kind of framework of 10 orders of magnitude. So thinking about again, so 10 billion people is a 10 over 10, very simple high school mathematics. And if you go all the way down to 10 over 0, that's every individual of this planet that will survive by then. And in between, interestingly, we see these levels in every order that we climb up. We see different these population groups that we have, the social groups that we have are appearing. So and also what is interesting here that the median population of all of these social groups, so 50% or more communities, for example, of this planet has around 10,000 population, or 10 over 4. So that aligns actually very well. Nation states, again, we were talking about 50% or more has approximately 10 million people. So you see the 10 over 7 there. So I kind of framed try to identify the cohorts of social groups again, who could possibly have the agency of action. And then basically I turned the question around, so who eventually has the agency? So if you're talking about from social tipping points point of view, who would actually, what is the ideal scale for triggering the social point? So we looked at this solutions database developed by Project Drawdown, where I worked before, Keith just mentioned. So developed this database of 100 current market ready actual solutions that you don't need to innovate, that are existing and that are already scaling. We can implement. So and if we do implement them at the potential they have, so they can actually take us to this 1.5 degrees Celsius target, limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius target. And so we asked for each of the solutions actually, who has the capacity, who has the agency for implementing them. And eventually we came up with this. So you see the bubbles. So the higher the bubble is on the screen, the higher the number of solutions you can implement in this for this, or these particular social groups can implement the higher the number of the solutions as you climb up. And you also see the numbers that are in the bubbles indicate that what would be the cumulative reduction of greenhouse gases, either by reducing emissions, cutting emissions, or by sequestering greenhouse gas emissions. And not to mention here, so we don't include the geoengineering and carbon capture technologies, CCS technologies here. That's sort of a different discussion to take, but I'm not pro or contra this discussion, but just to mention that we don't have that. And basically the color framing here is referring to the total financial benefit that we have. So that's also project drawdown looks at what would be the thing I'm talking about, benefits or loss in the financial term on a lifetime implementation of the solution. What would be the net benefit or net loss from the solution? And what we see, or what we found, this what we call the climate action sweet spot is the scale of 10,000 people group. So communities comprising 10,000 people. And at this scale, if we manage to implement all the solutions, and these are like the 56 of the 72 working solutions after some merging and other things, we find that 56, so that's almost 80% of the solutions actually can be implemented and be operationalized at this scale. And also that would lead to $8 trillion equivalent financial benefit. And the cumulative reduction of greenhouse gases would be 179 billion tons. So that's the highest reduction of the greenhouse gases is at this level. And if we kind of shift the narrative a little bit, kind of look at what are the top 3 cohorts where we would get the maximum benefit out, is basically the communities to the city scale. So 10,000 to 1 million people range. And if we do implement, and all the solutions can be implemented at those scales, and if we do implement them, we can actually achieve already 1/3 of the targeted emissions reductions. So that is 1,200 billion tons equivalent greenhouse gas reduction that we are targeting. So that can be achieved by implementing or focusing, prioritizing these 3 scales. We are working on looking at the evidences of that. Would that gonna really work out? But again, bringing in the concept of social tipping points, the paper we published in Proceeding of the National Academy of Science in 2020, we identified this 6 interventions that can trigger the social tipping dynamics. And many of those dynamics or sort of like the trigger points we are actually seeing at this scale, community scale. I will just quickly show some examples here. For example, Fridays for Future, that Greta Thunberg alone started, and kind of we see sort of a tipping behavior. It's subject to analysis, obviously, but as you see that almost no strikers in February 2019, it became within a matter of year 13 million strikers around the world. So that's kind of type of dynamics that we're expecting from social tipping. And if you look at the size of the school districts around the world where basically Fridays for Future is organizing this, so these are actually around 10,000 people scale. It's not a magic number to set in stone, some maybe 12,000, 15,000, but you see that there is a kind of orientation around this 10,000 people group around the world. So this number is working, at least for activism, if you like. And also, not to mention the social tipping point quality that was formed in the Dutch city, Amsterdam. So again, you see the city scale was the scale that was kind of targeted for triggering this type of tipping around there. So also some sort of evidence there. One other example that we have in Sweden that is a group that kind of collects locally and regionally produce food and kind of distribute them to the local inhabitants. So they meet at the parking spot once a month or once in another week. And so they are trying to kind of regionalize the food production and distribution to reduce the carbon footprint, and from the sustainability reason as well. So again, looking at the groups where this or communities that these groups are targeting or where they're active are again between these communities and city scale. I have a group in Karlstad. Karlstad is 100,000 people inhabiting Karlstad. So we see some similar dynamics here, and I also heard about projects in UK and currently working on with one of them, the Tayside bioregioning. So these are all kind of at this sweet spot scale that we are talking about. So from there, I would like to wrap up and open basically the floor for discussion after Viktoria's presentation, obviously. But what I am trying to get the message out here. So if we are talking about the intervention point or the scale of intervention to trigger the social tipping dynamics, and if you're talking about the prioritizing action at some scale, I believe that should be between the communities and urban scale. Well, it's not really a belief, it's scientifically evident now, as we found in the studies. And again, I want to emphasize that I'm no way undermining the role of nation states. They have a critical role to play. But when it comes to the point of prioritizing, so this is the community and nation scale, urban scale that we should prioritize. So what I say, climate action at scale, that matters. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Avit. That was a very interesting presentation. I see that there's already one comment that has already been, or question that's already been made in the Q&A box. If we want, we can start collecting these now. And as a reminder, we will have a Q&A session after our second presentation here shortly. So if you have an idea, you can start already, or a question, you can already start collecting those now while they're on the top of your head. Great. Now I'd like to transition over to our second speaker for the day. So our second speaker is Viktoria Spaiser, and I'm very pleased to introduce her. She is an associate professor of political science informatics at the University of Leeds. Viktoria is also affiliated with the Priestley International Center for Climate and the Leeds Institute for Data Analytics, LIDA. She has a background in sociology, political science, and computer science, so quite an interdisciplinary background. Her research interest is on sustainability research, and specifically in how societies can make rapid, fair, and empowering transitions towards zero emissions and zero pollution. Currently, she is doing full-time research on a UCRE Future Leaders Fellowship that she has recently received on understanding normative change to address the climate change emergency. So obviously very important work there. She applies mathematical and computational approaches to these and other social and political science questions. Viktoria has worked on a wide range of topics, including political participation, e-democracy, protests, polarization, democratization, and segregation using various sources of data, such as registry data and cross-country panel data, Twitter data, smartphone data, and various methodologies such as Bayesian stats, dynamical systems modeling, ABMs, and big data analysis. Her focus is now on climate change and sustainability research. So with that long introduction, I will stop talking and turn the floor over to you, Viktoria.
Thank you very much. I will start my slides. I hope they're visible and all set up. I actually can very much link on, on what Avit has said and build on that very nicely, since I'm going to talk a lot about social movements and their role in kind of driving social change. And specifically tipping kind of social systems. I thought I'll just quickly remind us of what actually we mean when we talk about tipping points. So of course, originally it comes from the idea of how Earth systems and certain elements within the Earth system can tip. So how small changes, perturbations within the system can then trigger such large changes that basically then the system changes from one state to another. And similar kind of definitions, though there's a lot of discussion of actually how do we define social tipping points. And again, I referred to the previous seminars where this has been discussed more in detail. But one kind of potential working definition that we can use here for social tipping points is that, again, it's kind of some kind of critical threshold in major social system components, the tipping elements, beyond which a small change can cause a qualitative change in the future state of the social system. And here, a very influential paper here was that by Ilona Otto with colleagues. Avit, I think you were also part of this author team, where it's basically how can we tip the social system from a business as usual state where we use fossil fuels, which obviously contribute to climate change, and how can we get to the decarbonized state by basically triggering certain social tipping interventions, basically to allow this phase transition to happen. In previous discussions within this kind of discussion series, a lot of emphasis was given also to kind of technology adaptation, was kind of given as a focus on how basically social tipping can work. So basically how societies adopt certain technologies, and how that can kind of drive the changes away from the carbon kind of based economy to a more decarbonized kind of based economy. And a report that has kind of come up recently was the breakthrough effect, that looks basically at different elements of where we can expect tipping to happen, or where already potential tipping has already started. However, quite often in those kind of focuses that on technology adaptation, what is quite often not paid enough attention to is actually the social change that needs to underpin those technological adaptation. Because of course, you know, we might never reach actually the state where technology becomes adopted and at a level where it really has a major influence on the society and on the state of the social system, for various reasons, because there are, you know, powerful interest, vested interests that, you know, that may want to hinder this kind of transition. There is also a cultural issue, how people perceive things, like what they value, and all those different kind of things play together. So quite often what needs to happen for technological adaptation, which is of course quite important, is actually a social change that underpins that. And just to give an example, so one of the technology adaptation tipping elements that, you know, has been analyzed is the proliferation of renewable technology, and specifically solar technology and solar power generation technology. And the German kind of law of feed-in tariffs that was passed in its modernized form in 2000, and then again the Energiewende law in 2010, is often credited as an important kind of trigger for this proliferation, as it kind of was quite important for driving down the prices. And indeed, if we look at the numbers, for instance, so the electricity from renewable energies production in Germany has increased from 6.2% in 2000 to 23.7% in 2012, and then again to 28% in 2014. And it actually stimulated also the global growth of solar panel production, for instance. And then because it then was so successful and other countries seeing the success, it became actually an archetype for similar legislation in 80 other countries, among others in China, where it was again kind of driving a lot of this solar panel production and driving down basically the prices for this energy source. So yes, absolutely. However, we have to kind of think, where does actually this law come from? So it doesn't come out of nowhere, this feed-in tariff law. Quite importantly, at that time when this law was passed, the Green Party in Germany was for the first time in the government, building a coalition with the SPD, and they were the ones who were driving this kind of policy. Now, the Green Party itself is actually a collection of grassroots movements that, you know, that were very concerned about environmental sustainability, but also nuclear energy as well. And they so they kind of basically were the first time elected into this kind of government and were driving this change. They themselves kind of coming back from social movements that started in the 1970s, and in fact, kind of who were building up this kind of understanding of how important environmental protection is. For instance, in 1980, a book has been published by this kind of social movements around environmental protection, which was called Energiewende, Growth and Prosperity Without Oil and Uranium. And that book became really kind of the backbone for the developing of the strategy that the Green Party then had for energy production, which then they brought into this government once they were in power. So it's quite important to see, like, you know, what is underlying, what kind of social changes actually has underlined this law that has then triggered this kind of technological adaptation. And even, you know, even afterwards, even after this law has passed, grassroots dynamics played a quite important role for this law actually becoming quite effective, because in the beginning, at least, it was mostly small actors. So like, you know, small farmers, co-op, citizen-led kind of groups, and non-industry kind of companies who started investing in green energy in Germany, mostly in kind of thermal and photovoltaic solar, but also bioenergy and wind energy, onshore wind energy. So, you know, even at that level, the kind of grassroots dynamics was quite important. And of course, also for the Green Party actually to be voted into the parliament so that they became part of the government. For that reason, for that to happen, there had to be enough kind of people who are voting actually for the Green Party. So also mindset shift in the population was important for kind of feeding this kind of changes. So, I mean, my point is kind of that every kind of technological adaptation is actually underpinned by some kind of social change, by change of how we perceive things, what we value, what we want to achieve as a society. And so that kind of brings me back to that, what if we want to achieve change in our society, we need to change hearts and minds of people. Kind of going back to the paper that I mentioned before by Ilona Otto and her colleagues on the social tipping dynamics, she actually identifies one of the key kind of social elements, social systems, where social system element where tipping has to happen is actually the norms and values system. And here she identified as a tipping point intervention the recognition of the moral implications of fossil fuels. So just kind of to define what actually are norms and values, also because quite often there's a confusion between those two terms. So norms are typically defining socially acceptable or desirable behavior. And norms transgressions are typically sanctioned in a society. Quite often we make the distinction between descriptive norms, so that's what we actually see people, how people behave, and then from that we infer what is normal, what kind of behavior is normal, what kind of behavior is expected from us. And then injunctive norms is like how people should behave, so where we think this is actually how it should be, but even though maybe some people don't show this behavior that would be desirable. And norms can change, and in fact, very, very quickly in certain circumstances, as we, for instance, seen with the coronavirus pandemic, where the situation, the pandemic has, of course, created requirements to shift certain behaviors very quickly. And so then certain behaviors that were perfectly normal, before the pandemic hit, became basically not normal and basically frowned upon during this lockdown, particularly phase of the pandemic. Values, on the other hand, define more what individuals value and prioritize in their own lives. So what kind of life goals they have and what they think is important in life. And that is quite often linked to social identity. So what, how people identify politically, but also in other terms. And those are more resistant to change. So they are usually quite much more stable. That doesn't mean that, that they're not important when we kind of try to trigger change, as I will explain in a moment. So in the context of kind of climate change, we now see that there are new norms emerging and some norms being redefined. So for instance, one of the new norms that seems to emerge and that has been now also discussed in the literature is the anti-fossil fuel norms. So basically saying that any activities to do with anti-fossil fuel production, consumption, subsidizing and so on is basically seen as morally unacceptable and should not be engaged with. In a more very kind of recent paper, there was, there's even now the idea of kind of persecuting, fossil fuel industry for their involvement in kind of creating kind of climate change. So it becomes then even beyond the norm, it becomes like a legal kind of norm where it goes even to kind of, in the criminal law. Another important norm that I think is emerging and that kind of is more a redefined norm is actually about the duty of care for children. So, our responsibility to our children to kind of make sure that they thrive and are healthy. And of course, in the context of climate crisis, this responsibility, this duty becomes in a way redefined. And here, the youth climate protest movement has played a big role in redefining this kind of norm. There are other norms which I think are at the moment less likely to be prevalent, though I mean I might be wrong about that, which is kind of the plant-based consumption norm, so that we go away for consuming meat, and then the pro-sufficiency norm. So in fact, it was quite interesting to see that within the recent IPCC summary report, sufficiency has been included as a measure of kind of trying to respond to the climate emergency. Sufficiency is basically the idea that we have to avoid our demand for energy, materials, land, and water while still kind of delivering for human well-being within the planetary boundary. So it's very much linked to kind of the degrowth idea of economies. As I said, I mean, the norms are kind of, defining what is acceptable behavior. So for instance, if an anti-fossil fuel norm is spreading, then that means that people, that people can no longer kind of drive petrol cars. That becomes basically an unacceptable behavior. People can no longer, heat their homes with gas, or like it becomes basically an unacceptable behavior. Their pensions, they would try to make sure that their pensions are not invested in fossil fuels. Also, it means it has an influence on what kind of political behavior we're showing. So we cannot then vote anymore for parties who are courtesing to the fossil fuel industry and kind of trying to protect them. So it is quite important. So if norms change, they do change behaviors with them. Now the values come actually quite important here as well, because so we know that, for instance, from research, that self-transcendence values, so these are values where that are characterized by universalism and benevolence, so where we emphasize that it is important for us the well-being of others, and biospheric values, which are connected actually to the self-transcendence values, which is kind of the importance that people pay to the to protection of environment. That those actually values are actually quite prevalent within societies, and yet we see that there is an apparent gap between values and how people behave, so the value-action gap. That people quite often, despite having those values, don't necessarily behave environmentally friendly. And there are various reasons for that. But one of the reasons why this is the case is because when they observe what other peoples are doing, they see other peoples not behaving sustainably. And so that they assume that the norm, so what is kind of normal in society is the non-sustainable behavior, right? So if we change the norm, if basically more and more people, let's say, adopt an anti-fossil fuel norm and hence kind of change their behaviors, that is then kind of also makes it easier for people then to behave actually according to their own values. So the values become more salient for them and for their behaviors. And in a way, what kind of norms, are becoming important and are likely to succeed is linked to kind of more foundational kind of moral foundations that that are driving many people. So what is morally right or wrong, and that's kind of linked to things like fairness and compassion and sustainability as a kind of more generic kind of moral understanding of what is right or wrong. And they're both kind of influencing, of course, the norms, but also what we value in life. So we have now an idea of maybe what norms are and what values are and how important they are for kind of potentially changing also behaviors, but also in fact policies, because of course norms not only affect individuals but also policymakers, and even at a national level, what kind of global norms are determining which agreements are reached at the national level. But how do actually norms then spread? How do we achieve actually a tipping within the norms and values kind of system? So one research kind of suggests that one way how norms spread is usually through complex contagion. So a simple contagion is how diseases spread, right? So if we meet someone who is infected, we become infected as well. So that's a simple contagion. Usually with norms and behaviors or ideas, this doesn't work as straightforwardly because there is usually a cost attached to adopting a new norm. And so people are more resistant to actually change. So what needs to happen is that they are actually exposed to this new idea, this new behavior, this new norm multiple times, so that there is a reinforcement of this exposure through multiple, ideally diverse sources. And diverse, I mean, that we have it basically from different people that are connected to us that receive this kind of new norm. Homophily, however, plays a role. So we're more likely kind of to adopt a new norm if we receive this exposure from people who are similar to us in various ways. And also the fitness of the norm plays a role. So how much we're saying it actually makes sense within the context of where we are acting. Another important factor for how whether complex contagion does take place or not is actually the network structure. So importance, for instance, is the clustering. So we know that in high clustering that we have a greater likelihood of multiple exposure. So this is exactly what we need for kind of this complex contagion to happen. Then the complex path length is an important. So basically, through how many nodes do we have to go to achieve complex contagion of a node? And then complex centrality, so basically the average complex paths that go through like for a node times give the complex centrality of a node. And ultimately, kind of this complex contagion then can foster social tipping through saddle node bifurcation and hysteresis. So that's kind of very much linked to what we know also from physical systems, like so where we reach a critical threshold of how many people have adopted a new behavior, and then it becomes a self-reinforcing kind of loop that kind of feeds on its own, even if we then remove, for instance, the original seeders of this new behavior from the network, let's say. And to go back to agency, it's quite important for at all kind of to trigger this kind of complex contagion. Actually, we need like people who start to seed like the network with those new ideas. So this is like where really the social movements, the civil society come in, because they're quite often the seeders, the kind of the norm-entrepreneurs who bring in those new ideas, who challenge existing normative understanding or like the business as usual, and bring in new ideas, bring in new kind of norms and behaviors. We know that, of course, from the past, we have seen that like with female rights movements like the suffragettes, who have kind of contributed strongly like to women actually getting voting rights, the civil society movement, the abolitionist movement, who was quite pivotal and important for actually abandoning slave trade and slavery. So all those movements played a quite important role to kind of move the society away from something that has been perceived as normal, that has been then challenged as not being normal actually and being wrong, to a new kind of state where a new understanding of what is normal and what is right has been achieved. And today we, of course, see a similar phenomena with other movements like the climate protest movements. A lot of actually the indigenous movements were quite pivotal, particularly in the beginning, to give our understanding of protecting the environment. And today we see it kind of spreading throughout different types of movements. So we have the Fridays for Future movement, so there's climate striking kids, we have Extinction Rebellion, and so on. So different types of movements who try kind of to change the society, who try to see the society with new understanding and new norms. So if we understand kind of the social movements as norm-entrepreneurs, the idea is, okay, so how do we get from those individual people who or small kind of groups to larger kind of scale changes? And that's actually links quite well with what Avit was talking about, this kind of scaling. So where we move from, let's say, P0, where we have one individual person, let's say Greta Thunberg, starting her protest, and how it kind of then, starts to spread by bystanders. So other young people who see her protesting and starting to join her, becoming upstanders. So we've seen that with Greta Thunberg. She was first alone. A few weeks later, a few other kind of young people have joined her. So then, they're becoming they're forming kind of community-based groups, starting to organize collective action rather than just an individual action, right? And building kind of first kind of a grassroots momentum. The more they see other people joining, it's kind of becoming a success. Basically, kind of they're having small wins by seeing that other people are joining them. That kind of drives the momentum to become bigger. And once kind of you have in several cities, similar kind of groups that kind of, organize and try to achieve something, then they start to link to each other, kind of, creating kind of a network of different grassroots groups, creating, values and identities kind of that hold those networks together, where they kind of then pursue larger kind of potentially, projects that they then can pursue together. And that kind of then, can spread further. Once they start to attract, outsiders, who are sympathizing with them, who then kind of join in as well, kind of, bring in maybe resources, kind of, new ideas, new ways of kind of, connecting those groups to other groups, and kind of that's how basically it spreads, and becomes greater, becomes the level of a community, of even a transnational kind of movements like we see with Fridays for Future. And similarly, this is how basically along this way, how those normative shift is kind of happening. Of course, in the beginning, those people are shifting the norms within their own kind of circle of influence, right? They, and then from there, it kind of starts then to ripple off. The more kind of people join, the more kind of, is kind of spreading within those circle of influence that kind of connects it then to, other external organizations who are sympathizing, who then bring those norms into their kind of circle of influence. how do they actually convince, people to join in and kind of to kind of become sympathizers, kind of to adopt their norms? Is actually through emotions, like for connecting to certain emotions, through narratives, for social sharing, through a story, right? For storytelling, where those norms are kind of, basically framed within a narrative that is, very kind of convincing. And with the Fridays for Future movement, we've seen that, because they redefined a norm that is actually quite important to many people, because many people do have, of course, children, right? So, and of course, we all, those who are parents, share the concerns for our children. So by kind of saying, well, if you are a parent and if you care for your child, how can you accept, that nothing is done about climate change? If you feel you have a duty of care for your child, that automatically means in this crisis that we're in, climate crisis, that you need to act, that you need to do something, you as adults, right? So they had a very powerful narrative, very powerful story, by basically identifying themselves as victims of our inaction against climate change, drawing many kind of, sympathizers and making this movement bigger and quite powerful. And we did analyze that with kind of large data from Twitter, kind of, we kind of tried to track down, their influence around the different COPs, or the UN FCCC annual conferences, where climate change is negotiated online, but internationally. So what we kind of try to understand is kind of, how do those normative understanding that those kind of kids bring in, did they actually permeate those discussions around the COPs, and how did that change over time, and who were actually the actors who were kind of driving this change besides the kind of the activists themselves, like who were other people who were drawn in, and it kind of started kind of to spread this idea, this normative idea that those young kids brought in. And what our paper has shown is actually that norm champions, beside the norm entrepreneurs, like the actual activists who bring in, who seed the new ideas, quite important are also norm champions. So that, in analogy with technology adaptation, that's quite often the early adopters of those new norms, of those new ideas, as they quite often are quite important to kind of to spread the ideas that comes from those activists to other, to kind of groups that are not connected directly to those activists, to which the activists don't have direct kind of connection. And of course, the question for any movement is kind of, to identify the right allies, right? Like the right kind of norm champions who can, multiply their ideas and who can kind of bring that in, who can spread that further. And there has been some interesting work done on what are the ideal kind of nodes within a network that can actually facilitate and accelerate the spreading. An interesting concept was kind of built around this kind of complex centrality that I mentioned before, but that seems to be applying more kind of to the seats. Like it's good if the seats, so the non-entrepreneurs, have high complex centrality. I think more work needs to be done to understand, to what extent that also applies to norm champions. There's a number of other work that has been done that suggests that, other centrality measures are also important when we look at norm champions rather than the seats, that it's important that they have this centrality also, like, for instance, being bridges between the different communities to spread the new ideas and to facilitate this complex contagion. But of course, this shift of norms, or this attempt to kind of to shift the norms, doesn't happen in a kind of isolated space. There are, of course, always competing ideas out there, competing norms, competing narratives. And so what every movement has always also to deal with is actually the norm entrepreneurs, so those who are actually opposing their norms and their kind of the shifts that they are trying to achieve, who try to maintain the business as usual. And what we have seen in our paper, but also that has been confirmed by other papers, actually, as we've seen an increase in the influence of those climate protest movements on our understanding of how we should respond to climate change, we've seen also an increase among right-wing activity that kind of tried to block those changes. So this is a response, of course, specifically because, of course, those who have vested interest in maintaining the business usual, they see this kind of, this as a danger, this the spreading of those new ideas, of those new norms. And of course, they then become activated and try to prevent that. And there are different ways how they can try to do that. They can try to basically cut the links, like to remove the edges between the the seats, so the activists, but also between the norm champions and other kind of communities, kind of to try, for instance, to block, to assure that they don't they get a platform where they can actually express, for instance, their views publicly. They can also kind of try to do that by basically raising the threshold by which, that how many exposures people need to see before they themselves become kind of adopters of a new norm, by, for instance, kind of, spreading, by discrediting, activists, also by kind of, spreading doubts about the kind of the new norm, by, for instance, through certain delay discourses, as has been analyzed. So there are different kind of strategies to how they would try to do that. So in a way, what we also see with kind of social tipping points is quite important to understand is kind of that it doesn't happen in isolation. There is usually always multiple dynamics going on, and they can compete and can block each other. And we need to better understand those dynamics. And we have at the moment not really a good understanding of how this is all interacting and working and not working. Generally speaking, I think, just kind of to conclude, I think we need kind of, a better understanding of how actor-driven social tipping can happen. We know from research that committed minorities, so norm entrepreneurs, norm champions, can change societies, can kind of influence change societies. We've seen it also in the past that this can happen, but it is important to better understand how social tipping can happen, including the enabling and impeding factors. And so that we can choose the right strategies. And that kind of, in a way, links also back to the talk that has been given by Manjana Milker at the last kind of those sessions of the time of this discussion series, which has been talking about governance, and kind of specifically governance that enables and positive social tipping points that empowers actors to trigger positive social tipping points that we want to see. Okay, that's thank you very much and now I'm really looking forward to receive some questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Victoria, and thank you again, Avit, for the wonderful talks. I think these two married nicely on each other. I think that it's nice to have an introduction to see how these scaling up dynamics matter, and then also how the norm and the individual level change can initiate these scaling up type of dynamics. So I thought in that way that they were really nice and complementary talks. So thank you two very much for giving these, and for the wonderful presentations, and for all the excellent research that you're doing. And so I'd like to switch over the time now to start taking some questions from both speakers. We've already had a little bit of back and forth in the Q&A. So for those of us that may not be familiar with it, please make sure to put any questions that you have not in the normal Zoom chat, but also in this other thing, there's a little Q&A there that allows us to track the questioning back and forth. But to help spark us off while we kind of start populating more of these questions, I'd like to pick up on something brought up by, excuse me, to make sure I say this is the right person, brought up by Susie Moser. And this is a question talking about particularly the role of agency here, right? And a question about agency often comes is necessarily who is allowed to actually use the agency, right? So if you say one of the main defining characteristics of humans is that they have agency, they can change the world around them, right? So of course, anytime there's agency, there's also a conversation about power. And this matters a lot for us, particularly when we're talking about issues of inequality and things like that. So I wanted to open up the floor a little bit to our two panelists here to talk to us about how agency can be used, and how we need to make sure that this agency is used in a way that we can develop our potentially rapid transformation processes in a way that is inclusive and that is incorporative and doesn't maybe exacerbate a number of the inequalities we're already worried about.
Do you want to start, or?
I could like, yeah, that was a great question. Thanks Susie, and also Keith for posing that. So I kind of see a sort of dichotomy here, because the in a way, so why I see this dichotomy to explain that, because the narrative has so far been, or the question has so far been, who has the power of climate action, and I kind of see it from a, I'm quite critical about that, because it's not, the discourse should be not about power. Actually, it's about the agency again that comes in, and these are kind of two contradictory facts here, because when we are talking about power, obviously, that's probably one of the reasons why the responsibility has been left on the hands of the national leaders in a way, because they seem to be having the most of the power in terms of when we're talking about the politics. But also kind of it sort of leads to denial in a way, I heard, because people kind of feel quite comfortable in a way that it's not actually their responsibility, or they kind of feel, well, you know, they don't feel the agency. It's a lot of like the lack of power. So I don't power as an individual, I can't influence much. So it's the responsibility of the nation, of the national leaders, or the political leaders. So this is kind of that has been a narrative so far. So one of the reason I conducted this study as well, actually, to shift the narrative to this real question: who has the agency? And I think that should be of the top priority. I know that the power dynamics will stay there, and we also see some sort of interesting transition there. In a way, we see that the communities are collaborating with the local governments. So that's something, you know, agency is kind of shifting the power dynamics. So we are seeing things there as well. So kind of projects started at the community level, and kind of the political leaders who have the power kind of started collaborating with the community. So you see kind of both the power and the agency, or the discourses around that, kind of shift. So that's kind of my point of view. I'm pretty sure Viktoria has more to add to that.
I actually agree, but I think maybe an important thing to distinguish is that there are different types of powers, right? So like, you know, there is the power, of course, based on resources, like, you know, power based on, like, you know, political power. So like, you know, what can I do as a political agent? But also there are things like moral power, like, you know, so how much can I actually, with my story, with my narrative, kind of, you know, change the discourse, change like how people think. And that's a very different type of power, right? Like, so I think it's important to understand, like, you know, that there's not just one power, and, you know, and that's unequally distributed. There are different types of power, and we can activate them to kind of, you know, to become agents of change.
I could quickly add to that. When it comes to the question of resources, that's the question I often get, because, you know, that often the question comes here: communities, you know, they can start projects, but where are the resources? They are kind of, you know, in the hands of the political leaders. But then again, I think the research around the, you know, citizen contribution or citizen generated resources kind of comes into play. So again, going back to the example of this community-led action, often we see kind of community kind of generates its own resources to start off a project, which kind of then supported by these political leaders who actually have the resources to continue through. So we are also seeing those dynamics there.
Do you have anything else to add to that, Viktoria? Or
No, I agree. I mean,
great. I'm trying to synthesize some of the questions that we have here. Another set of questions that I've seen come up a couple times was really how we can trigger these type of dynamics, right? How we can talk about how this change happened. I think Viktoria did a nice job stepping us through how bystanders can become activated, and how this activation can grow through like through the framework of understanding a social movement, right? But so, for example, Bev Adams asked, have you conducted any research at the individual level, which tracks what it is to move a bystander into action? And this also, of course, directly relates to what Avit has talked about as well, is how do we go from that, you know, that individual up to 10, up to 1,000, and so forth, right? So maybe you could talk about that a little bit, how we can actually, ways that we can look at this pathway and actually can trigger these people up. Upwards.
I'll just quickly start. So, I mean, how you do that is basically by appealing to emotions, right? Emotions are the ones like that activate people. So if people are enraged, like if they're really kind of angry because they feel like, you know, they've been betrayed, like, you know, like the young people who are building this climate protest movements are, that is a very activating, you know, like, you know, emotion. If they then, you know, have, I mean, if they're lucky, and then they have actually within their peer group other people who are feeling the same, or who are already becoming active, that of course it makes it easier for them to join in. But basically, like, you know, we activate people through emotions, and like, so for narratives, like, you know, that links certain norms and normative understanding to emotions that, you know, that activate us.
Exactly, I completely agree. I would just like to add to that. So there has been some discussion recently, currently, when Michelle Mann wrote this book, the new climate war. So the different ones. So again, so going back to the earlier discourses, fossil fuel industry kind of led this campaign into making climate change individual in a way, like it's individual fault, and it was actually in a way undermining this and kind of stopping this climate action. And from that, we kind of get into the individual action. And then again, of course, we need individual action. It's important to have that, but that wouldn't suffice if we can't trigger systemic changes from there. And I think that's where I kind of see the value of this community-based approach, because what is probably not possible. So individuals indeed have power, but when we are talking about scale, for example, very on the top of my head, if you're talking about wind power installation and others, probably individual role would be insignificant there. But you need to, when it comes to community, I think there is already, you see some sort of dynamics that's happening there. So where individuals kind of feel helpless in a way to get into action. So when they kind of engage in this community action, actually they can feel empowered and kind of take action as a part of the community, which they wouldn't probably do it as an individual.
Very interesting. If I may follow up on a point that Victoria made there. You noted the role of emotions and motivating people towards action. I find that to be a bit interesting because, as you noted in your talk, we have a very well-established attitude behavior gap, right? And something that's interesting about emotions is a couple things that maybe you could speak to on this. Is they are transitory, right? So we all feel many emotions throughout a day. So I think maybe it's not just activating emotions, but maybe activating emotions at the right time, towards the right way. And also emotions can also be particularly fragile in some ways, that emotions could potentially activate us in the ways that we don't want. There's also some research looking at things such as climate fatalism, which is problematic. People become over concerned. They believe that climate change is a fatalist outcome. There's nothing we can do about it. So therefore, I'm not going to act. So maybe we could talk a little bit more about how emotions can be used at the right time and things like that, because I think it's a bit of a sensitive area, right?
Yeah, I mean, it is a kind of, you're right. I mean, not every emotion is, of course, activating, right? So fear, though there's also contradiction research, so it sometimes shows that fear in combination with anger and hope can actually kind of, trigger emotion. So if we, on the one hand, we are fearing, of course, what will actually be the result of an escalating climate change, but we're also angry about that the governments have not done enough about this to respond. And we see also kind of, by seeing other people acting, we actually have some hope that something can be done. If this kind of mix comes together, that, is potentially activating. But if we're, for instance, we're exposed to the threat of climate change and we're really fearful, but we don't understand, that also, that we're not also feeling angry because something has not been done, because we have maybe not kind of made the link, and we just left with our fears, then that potentially is not activating us, of course, to become active. So yes, I mean, a specific mix is important. And so in a way that says, that if social movements kind of try to mobilize, they need to have certain strategies about how they communicate to people, how they try to mobilize them, so what kind of narratives they're using, and to what kind of emotions they're appealing, what kind of structures do they provide for people to actually join in, right? In a way that maybe also gets back to the first question about inequality. How can we make it inclusive? We have to make sure that not only we're trying kind of to activate the people, that we build kind of those open kind of forums where people can then join those movements to kind of become active as well. So that's a lot of kind of demand of social movements. Successful social movements have very good strategies in communication, very good strategies in kind of letting people in, supporting them, particularly in the beginning, right? Nurturing them as well. So it's not easy, right? But it requires a lot of work from social movements to make it right? And it's a very difficult task.
Okay, good. Thank you, Victoria. Avit, do you have anything to add to that, or should we move on to another question?
Well, I'm not really a psychologist, so
Okay.
but what I would like to refer to, and I think Daniel mentioned that is kind of quite earlier, but it was kind of brought into light by Catherine Hayhoe in her book Saving Us, is the active hope. So that's the trigger point in the emotion. So you feel emotionally better by actually actively doing something about it, and I think that's where the community comes into action again, because when you see that you have a community who are actually doing something to change the things, you feel better by engaging yourself. So yeah, probably that would be my addition to that, but I think Victoria did it nicely.
Next question I'd like to ask would be more directed toward Avit at this point. So the question is, I think it's really interesting, this idea of upward scaling transitions or scaling up. And I really like the power of 10 heuristic. I think it works nice to think about that, right? So a question maybe could be about where actually the transition points can happen. Where does the scaling up actually occur? Does it matter where it happens, and how can we maybe incentivize and create structures or conditions such that the scaling up along these power laws actually occurs?
I can start off. If we are talking about, I mean, well, the thing is, so to get into these dynamics, so activating the communities into action and then kind of scaling them up. So we need, first of all, an entry point. So what do you get that? And currently, what we are working with, can education be an entry point, something like that? So we kicked off a project in COP27, saying that can we use kind of schools? So again, connecting back to the emotions. So we have a generation left with climate trauma. Can we help them by actively engaging them into climate projects? And through this, can we turn schools into living labs? And then when you have a network of schools turned into living labs, you can easily connect those activities to the community, which is sort of like this catchment of the schools in a way. And so basically you hit the sweet spot. So that's sort of like the dynamics I'm at least expecting. And we see, for example, Fridays for Future, we discussed about that. You see that there's schools districts kind of are organizing their Fridays for Future. Eventually, they're kind of scaled up into global Fridays for Future movement. Similar dynamics we see in the Too Good To Go, which are targeted at reducing food waste. So you see that they're working in different supermarket districts and kind of combining efforts to scale that up at a global level. So I think we're kind of expecting a different level. So in terms of particular place, no, I don't think that would play much big of a role. But what is important here that we identify the right entry point and then kind of connect that, transition those action into this sweet spot. So kind of create this network dissemination. And I think that I'm not sure, I'm not an expert of networks, but I think there is some interesting research done in the network community and the network science that looked at that. So how can kind of this contagion happen through after a tipping point is triggered?
Yeah, and I think that's some of the stuff that Victoria talked about in her talk as well, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's one thing that's particularly interesting within a lot of the network sciences, particularly say the complex adaptive system sciences, is understanding about where the change happens, right? So say, for example, David Santola's recent book, wondering about, and we used to have a lot of this notion that it was really the central nodes that we were expecting to change, but in fact, actually the instigatory change might actually happen at the periphery, right? And that's where the actual real node shift matters. And then eventually some of the last nodes actually to change are the central nodes, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that it's quite interesting to view these things from a network perspective. But Victoria, you're much more the network scholar than I am, so I don't want to step on your toes here.
No, I mean, like there's it's ongoing research, right? Like, so people, now that we have like an interest in kind of how it actually can trigger social tipping points, we now kind of try to identify like, the strategies on networks, like, what actually does it mean, like, to trigger complex contagion, who are like the right nodes to target, and there is, I mean, it's ongoing research. So I said that, there's like this new measure of complex centrality, which is actually saying that, and quite often those people who are normally kind of, central nodes, like in terms of of between a centrality or in degree centrality are actually not the ones who have also the high complex centrality, right? So because, yeah, as you said, they can be actually quite often at the periphery. But so it's not the same measure. So I think we have to kind of also develop new metrics of kind of understanding who is actually influential on networks if we talk about complex contagion rather than simple contagion. And it's different metrics that matter here. But this is ongoing research, and I think this is important that more understanding is kind of created here with research.
Yeah, I'll tie this together really quickly. There is a recent paper in ecological economics by Ricardo Winkelmann. She's the lead author on that. And it particularly notes 4 key distinct characteristics of social tipping processes apart from, say, natural tipping processes. And 2 of those are ones that we've talked a lot about today. The first 2 are the role of agency, so human actors having the capacity to change their environment, and then the network structure of societies, right? And so I think that's when we're kind of looking at these differences between social and climate, I think that's a nice place for us to start. And those are definitely 2 keynotes that we've talked about in our discussions today. Shifting back towards Victoria, there's an open question here from Leonid Hinojosa, who says, how do you deal with the ambiguity of opinions and responses within groups? So ambiguity, so heterogeneity within groups, and then also changes over time. I think that's an interesting question. So how would you deal with that when, say, looking at these sort of network structures and norm changes?
I mean, the way I understand this question, I'm not sure I really completely understand this question, but so, I mean, yes, there is, of course, I mean, there are differences, like how, like, at what stage people become activated, like, like how much, like, how easily they are convinced. So there's this heterogeneity in that regards, of course. So you have always kind of early adopters, then, like you have kind of the next stage. And then at the very least are the laggards, like, people who are like, then adopting those kind of new norms or new behaviors at last. And quite often, actually, it isn't even important that they change their opinion. So it's not important that they then believe in this new norm. They might just change and adopt because everyone else has moved on. And in a way, like, they cannot maintain, like, their status quo on their own. So in a way, it's not even important that everyone, is agreeing on, like, this new norm, and everyone is agreeing we need to phase out fossil fuels. But if enough people do, this triggers the change that will then take everyone on board anyway, necessarily, right? I don't know whether that kind of answers this question, maybe on a different point in terms of ambiguity. So people, I mean, if it's referred to the point that, some people say, like, they're very concerned about climate change, but actually when it comes, like, to supporting policies or, like, acting, they're actually much less ready to do so. And I think a lot of it comes down to people being also not really informed very well of actually what is the efficient way to deal with climate change, right? So we see that actually quite a lot in research, that people don't understand what is the most effective way to deal with climate change, right? And to respond to climate change. So that's partly, like, where I think education partly comes in, like, to actually, make people understand what is most effective, but also, like, how you frame things, like, so, just like the way, if you frame it as a tax or as a kind of, I think as a subsidy, like, where it triggers kind of, changes, like, in what people support. So there are, small kind of changes that can kind of, shift this a lot. But if that's referring to the ambiguity, I don't know. Yeah, I hope that answers the question. I don't know, but please rephrase if not.
Good. I think we maybe have time for one more question, and I'll turn this back to one that was asked, I think, during or just right after Avit's presentation. And this is one from Daniel Ratila. And this says, this scale of 10,000 is very interesting framework. How does this fit with, say, a 3.5% rule, right? In which states that when 3.5% of the whole population has begun to participate actively in a social movement, success would appear to be inevitable. So this is looking at these sort of, say, threshold dynamics to social movements, right? So how maybe you two can both talk about that, because I think that relates to both of your work.
Yeah, I could start, and thanks, Keith, for chipping in there as well. I think that actually aligns very well. So, yeah, this critical threshold, 3.5%, and we see similar dynamics when it comes to the smartphones and several others. But the important thing here, I think, again, goes back to this entry point or intervention point, what it comes to. So where, or in terms of network, which is the node basically where this critical threshold is reached. And I think the communities actually work very well. Again, going back to the example of education, taking education sort of as an entry point and kind of hitting the sweet spot at the community level. So I see there this 3.5 rule actually works beautifully, kind of getting, you know, a set of schools that kind of driving the changes to the communities, and communities kind of disseminating through the network right at the node. But I'm not quite sure about sort of like the other entry points, other nodes, and I don't know if Victor, if you have anything to say there, but I see the connection or alignment very well when it comes to communities.
Yeah, I think this 3.5% refers to, like, you know, how many norm entrepreneurs, like how many seeds do you need to kind of to start the complex contagion, like within a network, right? That's a different kind of question from like how many people do you need like to have adopted the norm, like once, like, you know, you started your seeding, for it then to become a social tipping dynamic. So for it kind of then to kind of self-activate, and that's actually then a different number. I think that's then more closely to kind of 25-30%. It kind of varies a little bit from research to research. So yes, you need a certain amount of, you know, a certain amount of norm entrepreneurs, like so activists who actually started seeding things, and 3.5% is probably a good estimate for that, though again, like there will be variations depending on, like, you know, the context and situation. And then you need, like, you know, to get it like to about 25-30% of, like, you know, people who then kind of adopt your norm before it actually then becomes a self-reinforcing process spreading throughout the society.
Great, wonderful. I think that was a great set of comprehensive responses. Thank you. For the last question, I will allow, if you two have a question for each other, because it's not fair that we only get questions asked at you two. So would either of you have something you'd like to bring up for each other? Yeah,
I was kind of I mean, I was wondering, since, I mean, you're looking, I mean, Avit, you're looking at a different kind of scales, you know, like, you know, at what scales are kind of, you know, are people, you know, is the most effective interventions for climate change. I was wondering whether you also kind of look into how the changes between the scales happen, so how the scaling up can happen, and whether you have any work done on that.
Well, we did some work actually in this particular paper as well. So we looked at two structures, sort of like how kind of cascading effects happen. So when we talk about, you know, local, regional, and global actions, something like that. So how can kind of through this network, the local actions can cascade to regional and region to global. So that's another way, sort of like the geographical context. But what we also looked at is this Karen O'Brien's 3 spheres of transformation. You know, so when we look at the changes in the practical sphere, we need to go through the personal sphere and the political sphere. And we all saw that there's also one way of disseminating action and the impact using the powers of 10, where you can identify yourself at the personal sphere, the things that you talked about, norms and values. Actually, I had a question regarding that. And then kind of that feeding into changing the political sphere, and eventually that leading to the impact in the practical sphere. So these are sort of the work that we would like to kind of work on further. Something that we started working on is sort of like the scales of action in the Anthropocene, sort of like building on Ilona Otto's paper on agency in the Anthropocene. So what are kind of from an adaptive cycle point of view, if we are to adapt to this global challenges, including climate crisis. So what are the sort of like scales of action, and, you know, would like to kind of follow through formalized and informalized scales there. So yeah, these are sort of like the dynamics that we looked at. If I can just follow through with the questions, the norms and values, and the paper that you referred to. Actually, now you know officially, I reviewed that paper as well. How dare you? So now that was quite interesting. So in a sense, when you were talking about changes in the norms and values, and I think there was a question, I'm not sure with this Susie there as well. So how do you see that scale of intervention, tipping points, and the change of kind of norms and values coincide or marry? I mean, do you think that the changing the norms and values kind of take place at a different scale or different level, or do you see the value of the community scale when it comes to the change of values and norms as well?
Well, I see, like, you know, I mean, basically for the complex contagion, so, like, you know, there are seeders, like, you know, so norm entrepreneurs who bring in those new norms and values by challenging existing norms, like, you know, and bringing in new kind of new norms, ideas. And now what they have to do is kind of to convince others kind of to join in, right, kind of to adopt their norm, right? So, and then how they do that, like, I mean, I kind of try to discuss it, like, through, first of all, on a kind of, narrative level, like, how do they do that? But then on the more structural level, like, how do they do that? Like, by kind of linking up to, certain allies, by convincing norm champions kind of to spread this better within kind of their groups. So that in the end, like, at the end of the day, like, if a tipping happens, this new idea, this new norm that is not yet a norm, right, because it's not yet established and not a descriptive norm, becomes a descriptive norm, so that it doesn't become anymore like, well, we should not kind of, drive a car, but we don't drive a petrol car, right? So we also don't see, we see basically as becoming then a descriptive norm, right? So that's what we actually see people doing, not anymore kind of just something that they think that should or should not be done. So in a way, we change from like a new injunctive norm, what we should or should not do, but we don't see it yet happening, in at least not everywhere, or not at least in the majority, and it becomes a norm. So that what is really become a normal behavior then within a society.
Thank you.
Great. Okay. Well, I think we'll leave it there. So thank you so very, very much to Viktoria and to Avit for the wonderful presentations and the great Q&A. I thought that was really nice and enlightening. So I really appreciate that. So in this, last few minutes remaining, I want to give a virtual round of applause again to you two. Thank you very, very much for excellent presentations. Thank you very much to the organizers. Thank you very much for having us. This is, I think, a wonderful lecture series, and thank you for allowing me to participate. I really enjoyed doing this as well. Last thing that was asked is that I will plug the next lecture series. Cara, I'm sorry, I'm pulling it up here. It is on May 25th. It is on education and digitalization. Is that correct? Great.
No, there's actually one on terrestrial carbon in between, but I'll post it in the chat again.
Okay, I'm sorry, I messed this up. I'm not the professional here. Sorry. Yes, so wonderful. Please keep participating in this lecture series. I think it's really nice and really wonderful opportunity to learn from a lot of different types of disciplines. So, and of course, thank you all the participants for coming. It was a great time. So, I hope everyone has a wonderful day and enjoys the beginnings of spring.
Thanks so much.